way we've been approaching this today, which is essentially a purely detection-based approach using network approaches, is just not enough. So, the challenges, we all know the challenges. My guess is most of the people on this webinar are familiar with the OT or ICS security challenges. So I won't spend a lot of time on these things, right? But, to not have AD infrastructure in place, for instance, to have OEM managed systems, all of these things on the left-hand side create a challenging problem to secure these environments. And so what we need to have is we need to be able to do specific asset inventory and vulnerability management. We need to consolidate to reduce the resource risk, the resource requirements, because the resources are being constrained. We need to have real-time data about changes in the asset, in the endpoint, not just the data in the network, et cetera. And so we're going to have to find a way to deal with these challenges. And detection alone to do that just isn't enough. The traditional approach is, of passive network monitoring. So we monitor for anomalies. From an endpoint point of view, we may be monitoring those things manually. We have Excel spreadsheets. Maybe we have a scan that we do once a year to do a vulnerability scan on those devices because we can't scan them regularly because we can possibly trip off and brick certain devices. A lack of remediation or visibility into compensating control. So, okay, maybe I can't patch that thing, but is there some compensating control that I could put on it? But we have limited telemetry. So we're basically focused on just the network telemetry. So, what about all these other forms of telemetry like logs and endpoint detection information and firewall logs, et cetera? And so what do we need? We need to address both the risks of these environments as well as the threats. By risks, we mean the starting point, right? What is my fundamental risk? But also then, okay, I got to understand what are the threats that are taking advantage of those risks. We need to integrate a more comprehensive telemetry, and then we need to integrate response to provide that kind of XDR capability. So, as I mentioned, risk and threats. So on the risk side, before we go anywhere, we've got to recognize that in whatever we do, we have to realize that these systems are quote unquote insecure by design, insecure by neglect. We can call them whatever we want, but basically we've got things like shared passwords. We've got dormant accounts. We've got old systems like XP or Windows 2000 or Windows 7. We've got sensitive embedded devices down there. We've got dual home NICs. So wonderful, we've got a firewall, but then we've got 3 systems, servers that have dual NICs. So they're going around that firewall so that I can have remote access because the vendor needs remote access. I've got tons and tons of patches that are needed, but unapproved by the vendor or haven't been deployed yet. The starting point for our security journey in OT starts with a set of starting risks that we have to recognize and we have to deal with before we move on, before we start doing detections, and before we start thinking about threats. We got to deal with the risks. And when we think about those risks, and we said before that we think the network only approach kind of falls down. Well, it falls down because I don't know those risks. So yeah, I know it's a Windows box from looking at the traffic, but I don't know the patches that have been deployed. I know it's an OS version, but that doesn't tell me exactly what the patches that have been deployed. I don't know the policies on that device. I don't know the users and accounts. I don't know what applications are running on that device unless they happen to be communicating over the wire, et cetera. And then even if I do, I can't do anything. I can't patch the system. I can't harden a config. I can't remove that user that shouldn't be there. I then have to go in manually and do those exercises. And on the detection front, all I've got is network traffic to do the detections. And so there's a fundamental gap in this approach in our view. And then when we move from those risks that we mentioned to the threats, to how to detect an actual threat that's occurring, we actually thought the recent evaluation on the ICS MITRE attack framework was quite interesting. This is Dale Peterson's comments on it. But the fact that all 5 products that were evaluated detected the attack. In some ways, it wasn't that hard, right? It was pretty obvious set of attacks. But importantly, just looking at the network traffic wasn't really good enough, right? Having the Windows logs would have been really helpful. Having OT firewall logs or endpoint detection logs would have been additional help in detecting any threats. And then querying PLCs directly, actively querying the PLCs to pull back information from those PLCs to know what was going on. Essentially, additional forms of telemetry could have been very beneficial. When we think about that, this is when we start to say there's got to be a way to think about XDR, meaning bringing in a broader set of telemetry, not just networks, to respond to these threats. So how do we do that? How do we bring risk management or risk reduction and threat detection and response together to improve our starting point, demonstrate success, as well as to detect and respond to ongoing threats? So when we say XDR, what do we mean by that? It's a very subjective term, probably. So the X is multiple dimensions, right? And the DR is detection and response. So multi-dimensional detection and response. That to us means integrating telemetry from multiple sources. It also means integrating the response with all of the availability of all of the information available from the endpoints, et cetera. And that improves the detection and response with better insights on the threats and how to respond, which is really beneficial in OT. And so the reason we're so focused on both risk and threat is if all I'm doing is trying to detect threats, by the way, with only one form of telemetry, network data, I don't know the risks. And so I can see a detection, but I don't know how can I solve that? How can I stop that threat from happening by reducing the risk in my environment? In other words, can I patch it? Can I change a configuration setting? Can I remove a user? It's a pass the hash attack and it's being by a particular user. Can I just eliminate those users on these accounts? By bringing that risk picture and the detection picture together, I can start to build a true response plan that makes sense in what we think of as the least disruptive response possible, or LDR. So what would that look like in OT? Well, it would look like risk reduction. So it would look like knowing what those environmental factors are that could create a chance of an event. They're flat networks, unpatched vulnerabilities, dormant accounts. So these are things that an attacker can take advantage of and then reduce those risks. So, okay, let's remove those accounts and users. Let's remove software that shouldn't be there. Let's harden the configurations on those networking devices, et cetera. But it would also include threat response. So what is a threat? A threat is an active behavior that could cause impact, typically by taking advantage of one of those risks on the left-hand side of this page. But then importantly, it's also the response. Detecting, so identifying a real threat, investigating it. What is the depth of that threat? In other words, where could it go? What could it do? Planning for the least disruptive response to that threat. But then taking that action, being able to immediately go in with a human, in our view, intermediating it, but basically saying, look, we can think, okay, this is what's happening in the environment, and we should take this action. But that action is then controlled by a human user before triggering the action. But it would have, XDR and OT would have both of these capabilities so that we can reduce the amount of risk we have and then respond to the threat in the least disruptive way possible. So where does it start? Well, it starts, you cannot do this without having a risk view of every asset in your environment, because that is what tells us where the threat could spread or where it could start. And number two, what we can start to do right away before the threat exists to remediate those risks. That includes vulnerabilities, patches, configurations, users' accounts, et cetera. And by looking at that 360-degree view, I can prioritize my resources against those risks that are greatest. And I can start to resolve insecure by design assets. I can stop the spread of threats by modeling where those threats may move if they happen, because I have that full picture, right? We think a lot about, people talk a lot about doing red teaming or pen testing of OT environments. So pen testing OT is a challenging thing to do in any level of depth because of the risk to operations that it could cause. By having this risk view, you can run lots of pen tests, lots of scenarios of what could an attacker do given the risks in the environment. To do that right, you've got to start with really deep endpoint visibility. You got to get all the way down to that asset. You got to be able to see what installed software is there, what's the patch status, what are the password settings. The only way to get this right is to get that deep view. So that's the risk side, identifying those risks, knowing what could go wrong, et cetera. But then XDR also requires a wide range of telemetry. That's what the X is about. Right? We got to be able to bring in as many different forms of telemetry as possible. syslog, netflow, configuration changes on the device, to Dale's point about querying the PLC, device metrics. Are we seeing a spike in CPU usage? Windows logs themselves, user behavior, file creation, et cetera. Firewall logs, so perimeter NIDS type firewall logs. AV or whitelisting and other process creation logs. Deep packet inspection or interior NIDS. And then because we're in OT, because we are actually operating a physical process, well, let's bring in the physical process alarms, because at the end of the day, that's what we're worried about disrupting. And so all of those different forms of telemetry should come into an XDR platform. And then the detection elements use all of that data in an integrated way from a manual point of view to discover and visualize threats, but most importantly, from an automated way. So to be able to do anomaly detection across those different dimensions so that we can see when different anomalies are happening, but also by having that data to reduce the false positives because we're starting to correlate across the systems. And then obviously rule-based detections, things like ICS, like MITRE ATT&CK for ICS, where we can create signature type based detections as well. But the XDR really needs to include all of those different forms of telemetry and integrate that with the risk picture that we talked about before.